In this reflection session of the seminar, I'm going to take stock of some of the key points, offer a couple of clarifications and extensions, and also invite you to think of if there's going to be another edition of this online seminar, what would you like to see me discuss in addition to the topics that were discussed in this edition and its sessions? Let me start by revisiting the content of the seminar. I've tried to discuss both the methodological aspects and the more social collective aspects of scholarship. So the more methodological issues were discussed in sessions 2 and 3 when we looked at reasoning and argumentation. And then in sessions 1, 4, and 5, I emphasized the more collective aspect of research. I think that it's really important for all of us to understand these two aspects and how we should try to strike a balance or cover both bases as we're thinking about what am I doing as a researcher? What kinds of questions am I interested in? And how do I make them resonate with an audience? Of course, there's only so much I can say about reasoning in a 90-minute session. And since the participants in this seminar come from very diverse backgrounds and do very different kinds of research, my discussion was unavoidably at a fairly general level. So we would obviously have to contextualize these issues and look at them in the context of specific research designs and research questions. So there's a lot we could talk about in terms of, let's say, reasoning in quantitative research. And indeed, when I sit down with my own doctoral students and students that I teach who do quantitative research, we look very carefully and in detail the reasoning that goes into turning a theoretical foundation or a theoretical proposition into an empirical model and then estimating that model. So there's a lot of nuance that I have consciously avoided because I wanted to keep this at a general level. As I'm thinking of what topics might be added, I'm tempted not to eliminate any of these 5, but as I'm thinking of what could be added to this, I think that having a conversation on knowledge interests might be a useful addition. It was kind of embedded in discussions regarding 1 and 5, but it might actually deserve a session unto itself. So one more time, going back to this idea of sitting around a table, asking the question, why are we there? What motivates the questions that we're asking? Whom are we privileging? Again, I do research on governance, and as I'm thinking of, well, whom does my research ultimately serve? Whose interests am I privileging? That's something I really want to think carefully and be mindful about, because every way of asking a question is going to serve the interests of some entities, collectives, individuals, while ignoring, downplaying others. So in corporate governance, we could serve the interest of shareholders, interest of top management, interests of boards of directors, employees, the surrounding communities, policymakers, lawmakers, and so on. So as we are talking about how to do research on governance and what kinds of questions to address, we're always going to be at least implicitly privileging the interest of some over the interest of others. And my invitation would be to make this implicit explicit. And of course, there's a broader conversation about knowledge interest that might merit another session. Here's my final exercise for you. If I were to add content to this seminar in the next edition, what would you like to see? What topics do you think would be of sufficiently general interest that they could complement this general level discussion that we had, that you think may be missing or you would like to hear more about? I'd be very happy to receive email from you with suggestions. Let me try to summarize what I consider to be the most important messages that I'd like to convey to you. And you can read as little or as much prescription into these. My main prescription is for you to think about these issues yourself. So my first point is to remind you of the collective aspect of scholarship and research. Research is not about me, it's about my participation in a conversation. So my task as a researcher is to engage a community of my peers. And I mentioned this in the last lecture, this idea that I have some reservations, concerns with the idea that I should do research on something I feel passionate about, or something that has meaning to me personally. And again, I'm treading very carefully so as not to give you a prescription, but my own approach to doing research is I think of research as a professional activity. And as I think of the topics that I do research on, I try to keep a healthy emotional distance to the topics. Because if I get emotionally involved, if I get passionate about transaction cost economics, I'm afraid that that may create some blind spots in my thinking. I may start inadvertently endorsing some backings and warrants, to use Tullman's terminology, over others. I understand the sentiment that we should be passionate about what we do. But in my own research, I have replaced the word passionate with meaningful. I seek meaningful research questions. But as I'm thinking of what's meaningful, I'm not so much thinking of what's meaningful to me, but what is meaningful to the conversation. And this applies outside of scholarly communities as well. I apply the same principle in the classroom. When I walk into a classroom, my task as a teacher is to engage a community of students. Or if I sit down at a table with policymakers, my task is to engage those policymakers in a conversation. So ultimately, this is about contributing to a conversation. It's not about me. The second point I'd like to make is methodological, and it links to reasoning and argumentation. Over the years, and the more I have done research and evaluated research, it has dawned on me that our reasoning and argumentation are much more complex activities than I thought they were, and that they have both an individual and a collective dimension. So reasoning is not just a cognitive activity that takes place inside my head. It has a fundamental, profound collective dimension as well. And as individual and collective activities, reasoning and argumentation are always embedded in theoretical and empirical considerations that are surprisingly local. So it's really difficult to say anything general about reasoning and argumentation. Ultimately, we have to take it to the intellectually local context. Another thing that I have come to appreciate as of late is that I always understood that my reasoning and my argumentation and my research may be driven by ethical considerations and value judgments, and that they may have ethical implications. But one of the key insights for myself that I gained from working on the analysis of Thomas Piketty's work was that I realized that our reasoning and argumentation are in many ways embedded in value judgments and ethical considerations, as well as policy. So we can't escape value judgments even when we engage in reasoning and argumentation. So our reasoning and argumentation are ultimately ethically embedded. And as we analyze the structure of arguments, we find those value judgments and ethical considerations often in the backings and the warrants. So reasoning and argumentation are complex, and I don't think we understand as much about them as we think we do. So I'm going to quote Peter Lipton, who was a philosopher who wrote a wonderful book in 2004 called Inference to the Best Explanation. In the final paragraph of that book, Lipton writes, quote, "I am acutely aware that this book has only scratched the surface of our inductive practices, or even of one particular and partial model of those practices, both because of the hardness of the surface and the softness of my nails." End quote. I think this is part of the epistemic humility aspect that we talked about in the reasoning session. Let's be realistic of how well we understand our own reasoning and argumentation practices. This said, one thing seems certain to me. Nobody knows how you reason and argue better than you do. We all need guidance. I remember when I was a doctoral student, I remember that I needed guidance. Even though I was always critical of the guidance given to me, I still needed it. And I tried to give guidance to my doctoral students and in my doctoral seminars. And you may have noticed that there are many senior scholars who are happy to dispense guidance and counsel and prescription. I would like to highlight the sense of responsibility here. Always choose very carefully what kind of advice and guidance to heed. And certainly never follow a recommendation you do not understand. I am compelled to say this because I teach quantitative methods to doctoral students, and too often I find a student using a statistical test that they really don't understand. So I ask them, okay, as you're using this test here, what is it that you're doing? What do you think this test is going to do for you? And I find that the student doesn't really understand what the test is, what it was meant to do, and what the results of that inferential test mean. So I worry about this, and this combined with the notion that there are many scholars who are happy to give advice, even explicit recommendations. This is where you have to accept a sense of responsibility. Make sure that no matter what guidance or prescription is given to you, you understand what that prescription is and why you should follow it. I have emphasized in every session that you should not read the material as prescriptive. The reason I have done that is because I have found, and I found myself doing this as well in the past, I would read something that I now realize was meant as descriptive. So this person is describing what has worked for them, and I read it as if they were given counsel in terms of what I should do. But no matter what the context, somebody describing what worked for them doesn't mean that it's probably going to work for you, or that you should just blindly mimic that person and their procedure. When I seek guidance, I still seek guidance, but I seek guidance in the form of questions. And when I give guidance, I try to give questions instead of answers. And that's why this entire seminar has centered on asking questions. Questions that I invite you to address yourselves in your own context. You are the only person with the requisite expertise to answer the question in your own context. But what others can do is they can help you spot maybe questions that you haven't considered, maybe boundary conditions that are in your blind spot, and so on. Let me also revisit the rigor versus relevance distinction. Pitting one against the other makes no sense to me. No matter what the context in which I'm trying to compel an audience, unless I am rigorous, there's no way I am going to be considered relevant. The rules for rigor and relevance are very local and context specific, and that's why it's again difficult to speak of rigor and relevance at the general level. We have to understand that these are always locally negotiated rules and expectations. And again, let's go back to sitting around the table and I'm trying to convince an audience. Well, I need to ask who is in the audience. Academics who think like me, academics who don't think like me. Students, experienced executives, policymakers. So as I'm thinking of relevance, I need to think of the composition of my audience. And ultimately, that audience also decides whether what I'm telling them is rigorous. What is that based on? What kind of empirical material have you used? What kinds of assumptions have you made? And this goes back to the reasoning and argumentation criteria. Let me briefly comment on the notion of practical relevance or managerial relevance. Sometimes younger scholars misinterpret this to mean that you have to give counsel, that you have to give prescription. That's not how I think about being relevant. I think about relevance in terms of, am I successful in engaging my audience in a conversation where we start exchanging ideas? But that doesn't mean that I have to give advice or a prescription. Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say that I am talking to an executive or maybe a board member or an investor who is really convinced that the CEO can also serve as the chairperson of the board, sometimes known as CEO duality. If I find myself in a conversation with someone or a group of people who really think that CEO duality is a good thing, what I usually do is I lean the other way and I ask, under what conditions, under what assumptions, in what contexts is CEO duality useful, and how and why? And then I invite them to think of contexts in which the opposite, CEO independence, so the CEO and the chairperson roles are separated. I ask them to think of contexts in which that might be a better idea, separation of powers. And then I invite them to do kind of a comparative analysis of these two feasible options in the given context and try to come up with some kind of a decision rule by which you arrive at the conclusion that CEO duality is preferred. And many times in these conversations, we uncover important boundary conditions that help us understand the issue in its entirety, as organizational economists would say. But my role in the conversation is not to give prescriptions or direct counsel, but to help those who I'm conversing with to think about the issues also from the points of view that they haven't considered. And many times in these conversations, I also find new ways of thinking about issues. So being relevant simply means being relevant in the conversation. And there are many signs that you are being relevant. People are paying attention to you. They are building on your ideas. They are challenging your ideas. This is what relevance is. Keeping your audience interested and seeing signs that they're engaging. And this applies, again, in just about any conversation. But I think what you will find is that unless you are rigorous, unless you are observing the rules that the conversation has adopted for rigor, then there's really no hope of being relevant in the conversation. In the sessions, you have not heard me use terms like critical realism or constructivism or objectivism versus subjectivism. And the reason is I've never found much use for isms or ologies of any kind. So imagine that I'm sitting around a table and somebody declares that they are a scientific realist. Well, what are the implications? What are the consequences? Why should I know what ontological orientation you have adopted? Why is it relevant? I've never felt compelled to declare my ontology in the conversations. My principle has been, don't declare, demonstrate. So instead of saying, I adopt this ism or this ology, just show what you've done. Remember the descriptive, prescriptive, normative criteria for reasoning. No need to declare anything as long as you make your reasoning and argumentation transparent. Same thing with someone saying, oh, I used an abductive approach here. Again, I don't know what that means. And whether you label your research abductive, deductive, or inductive, I am absolutely certain that you use all three forms of reasoning in your research. And again, remember that there are several dozen variants of abduction. So I have many different ways of thinking about abductive reasoning. those who declare an abductive approach usually don't specify which form or forms of abductive reasoning they are using. To me, saying that you're using an abductive approach is almost like a quantitative researcher saying, oh, I'm using statistical inference. Well, for me to understand what exactly is it that you're doing, we have to have a much more detailed conversation about how exactly you use statistical inference and what are the other forms of inference aside from statistical that you're going to use in your reasoning and your argumentation. Let me briefly revisit the Dutton and Dukerich article on the homeless people in New York and how the New York and New Jersey Port Authority dealt with the issue. The Dutton and Dukerich study is a grounded theory study, but interestingly enough, the one and the only reference to Glaser and Strauss, the architects of grounded theory, appears in the last paragraph of the article, where the authors note, almost as an afterthought, that their approach was consistent with the spirit of Glaser and Strauss. To me, this is a great example of this principle, don't declare, demonstrate. So when you clearly show what you have done in your research, you don't have to declare your approach in your introduction or in your abstract. You can kind of give it as an afterthought, but if you ask me, they really didn't have to cite Glaser and Strauss at all. They demonstrated they did not need a declaration. This concludes the online seminar, Contributing to Theory Progress. My objective has been to invite you to think about the key questions that you, as an emerging new scholar, have to think about as you're thinking of your own research, how to do your research, how to write it up, how to present it to an audience, and so on. And I want to emphasize both the methodological and the individual level aspects, as well as the central collective aspects, such as peer review. Please keep thinking about these questions. Go back to the materials, seek new materials that help you develop your own thinking. Let me briefly discuss the evolution of the content of this seminar. So this started as a face-to-face seminar in 2010. Some of the topics were slightly different. Some of the readings I had initially included didn't really resonate. So you are in some sense benefiting from well over a decade of evolution of the seminar. So the materials that I have cited in the online sessions have stood the test of time, in that they are readings that students continually find useful as they're thinking about their own research. Year after year, students come and talk to me and say, oh, I really enjoyed the Locke and Goldenbiddle article. It really helped me understand the notion of contribution better. Or the Toulmin model was really useful as I was trying to understand what the role of empirical material and assumption are in my arguments. So we are all benefiting from the valuable feedback that I have gotten from the students who have taken this class. And I happily welcome any feedback that you might have on the content. If it feels that I have been giving advice or counsel, think of it this way. I was really given counsel to my younger self when I was a doctoral student back in the late 90s. I have a very vivid recollection of many of the things that I struggled with. There were a lot of things I didn't struggle with, but then there were topics that I found myself thinking over and over again. I was questioning both the implicit and the explicit advice and counsel that I was given, and I came to the point where I said, I need to figure these things out myself. I looked at a research article and it said deductive research, and I started looking into it and I said, I don't think this is deduction. Well, there are deductive parts here and here, but there is so much more going on here than just deductive reasoning. So then I decided I need to dig deeper into this. And then I started talking to colleagues and I realized, you know what, there are many others who are asking these same questions. So I started forging relationships with co-authors. And the more we looked into these issues, the more we realized that this is much more complex than we thought, and that we really need to analyze these things in more detail. Now, there may be some emotional comfort in the idea that something that is complex is actually simple. But to me, that's ultimately self-deception. Something that's complex is complex, period. Our task is to make that complexity tractable instead of simplifying it. My tongue is only half planted in my cheek when I say, if after listening in on these conversations, you think that research is much more complex than you thought it was, then my message has been delivered. I think it's the most promising way of ensuring progress, that we realize that we're dealing with complex issues. Reasoning is more complex than we thought. There are several dozen variants of abductive reasoning, for instance. And then we start making the complexity tractable as we're trying to understand, well, what is it that we do individually and collectively when we create knowledge, and when we are evaluating whether that knowledge should be accepted into the broader conversation, the body of knowledge, if you will. If you find yourself asking questions that you didn't ask before, or if you find yourself revisiting questions that you already have asked yourself but are now thinking of differently, then this seminar has more than served its purpose. In closing, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey, and I wish you all the best in your research and your careers wherever they may take you.